Welcome to the back room. Relax, unwind, and let our soothing gangster bedtime stories guide you into calm and peaceful sleep. Here we tell the quieter side of history, the childhoods, ambitions, and lives of legendary gangsters, without focusing on violence. As you settle in, share with us in the comments where you're listening from, what time it is right now, and one good thing that's happened to you today. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy our stories, please like this video to support the channel and subscribe so you never miss a new upload. Your encouragement helps us bring more mafia bedtime stories to life. Now close your eyes, feel at ease, and enjoy tonight's story. Wishing you peace and the sweetest dreams.
On certain winter nights in Washington, D.C., the city seems to exhale. The streets fall into a muted rhythm, the kind shaped by rain that drifts rather than falls, carried by a cold wind that sweeps through empty intersections. Streetlights glow like distant amber stars, softened by the mist, and the world feels suspended in a quiet that is both peaceful and uneasy. On one such night, many years after the events that would define him, a lonely newspaper box stood at the corner of a dimly lit block. Its glass window trembled softly from the rainfall, and behind it sat a headline that once seized the nation's breath: Rayful Edmond III arrested. The ink, frozen in time, seemed to whisper a story much older than the night itself. This moment, this silent testament to a life that had shaken a city, the story gently rewinds. The rain continues its steady tapping, and the years peel backward, carrying us into the childhood of the boy who would one day become the name printed beneath that headline. The city remains the same in structure, but different in spirit. The streets are warmer, livelier, younger. The rhythm is different, too alive with voices, laughter, and the clang of metal doors from corner stores where people greet each other by name. Washington in those days was a place of layered realities, where beauty and turbulence lived side by side, never fully separating. Rayful Edmond III entered this world not with noise or grand promise, but with a quiet presence that hinted at deep observation. He was a boy who watched more than he spoke, absorbing the patterns of his surroundings with an attentiveness that felt far older than his years. Neighbors often recalled his stillness, how he would lean against a railing or sit on a stoop, eyes steady, taking in everything without drawing attention to himself. The soft hum of the streets became part of him early on, the laughter spilling from open windows, the faint music drifting from passing cars, the occasional argument that lingered like static before dissolving back into everyday noise. His family shaped him in ways both gentle and complex. His grandmother, a firm yet loving presence, created a sense of structure that wrapped around him like a protective shell. She ran her household with rules softened by affection, teaching him small lessons through daily rituals, folding clothes, cleaning the porch, greeting neighbors with respect. Her voice carried the calm authority of a woman who had lived through storms but still believed in the tender power of guidance. In her eyes, Rayful saw warmth, expectation, and the kind of stability that gives a child a sense of belonging. His mother brought a different energy, determined, guarded, and marked by a connection to the city's underground economies. She moved through the world with a blend of calculation and charisma, always balancing her own ambitions with the realities around her. To Rayful, she was both familiar and distant, someone he admired without fully understanding. She taught him about resilience, about reading people, about holding one's composure even when the air vibrates with uncertainty. Her influence settled over him quietly, forming the earliest threads of a dual identity he would one day embody. The streets of Washington were a world of their own, living organisms filled with unspoken codes, shifting alliances, and a subtle pulse that could be felt more than explained. Rayful grew up sensing its contradictions: the kindness of neighbors who passed down food during holidays, the tension of men lingering on corners late at night, the feeling that opportunity often arrived wrapped in shadows. To a child, these contrasts were not contradictions but simple realities. existing side by side without the need for explanation. He attended school like any other boy, walking hallways filled with chatter and motion. Teachers sometimes noticed the intensity of his gaze, the way he seemed to listen even when his expression remained unreadable. He was not disruptive, nor was he eager to draw attention. Instead, his presence carried a quiet gravity. Children respected him instinctively, even before he understood the reasons behind such reactions. There was something about him that suggested depth, a stillness that made others lean closer without realizing why. Outside the classroom, the world continued shaping him. He noticed how money changed people, the way conversations shifted when it appeared, the way doors opened or closed depending on who carried it. He watched older boys move through the neighborhood with confidence that seemed to command the air around them. He listened to whispers about families who lived by day in one world and by night in another. These impressions settled into him like sediment, layer upon layer, forming early questions about power, choice, and the paths that stretched before him. Yet his childhood was not defined by darkness. There were moments of genuine laughter, evenings filled with the smell of cooking drifting through the house, mornings when sunlight cut through the blinds and cast warm patterns across the floor. He played ball with friends in small parks, chased summer breezes through alleyways, and felt the quiet comfort of belonging to a community that, for all its struggles, held its people close. This tenderness would stay with him, buried beneath later events but never entirely erased. As he grew older, Washington itself seemed to shift. The city carried an undercurrent of pressure, economic, political, social, each shaping the streets in ways that were subtle but undeniable. The balance between aspiration and survival grew more precarious, and the spaces between innocence and experience narrowed. Rayful, still young but perceptive beyond his age, sensed these changes before he fully understood them. The world he was walking into was not the same world he had known as a child on another quiet winter night years. After the rain fell against the newspaper box, the story of Rayful Edmond III would become a headline. But here, in the early chapters of his life, he remained simply a boy standing at the threshold of possibility, shaped by the softness and the shadows of Washington, D.C. His journey had not yet begun, but the city had already placed its hand on his shoulder, guiding him toward a path that would one day lead him back to that rain-soaked corner. And in the stillness of his youth, beneath the dim glow of streetlights and the whispered truths of a restless city, the first echoes of his future quietly took form. The city was changing long before Rayful Edmond understood what change meant. Washington, D.C., in the late 1970s, carried a restless pulse beneath its surface, a tension that moved through its streets like a quiet electrical current. The storm had not yet broken, but its signs were everywhere for those who knew how to read them. Rayful was still young, then old enough to notice the shifting atmosphere around him, too young to understand that he was growing up inside a moment that would later define a generation. In those days, the city was a paradox, majestic monuments on one side, fractured neighborhoods on the other. Power lived in polished buildings lit long into the night, while just a few miles away, entire blocks felt forgotten by the nation whose capital they hosted. It was a place where hope and hardship lived as reluctant neighbors. The smell of summer, rain mixed with exhaust fumes, sirens became part of the city's natural soundtrack. And at dusk, the streetlights flickered awake as if bracing themselves for what the night might bring. Rayful often walked these streets with quiet curiosity. He watched everything: conversations on stoops, heated arguments that ended as quickly as they began, the way older boys leaned into corners like they were guarding invisible borders. He didn't speak much in those moments. He simply absorbed, storing what he saw like a young observer learning the unspoken rules of an environment no one explained out loud. Washington, D.C. was not yet the epicenter of the coming crisis, but small cracks were forming. Factories had closed, Jobs were disappearing. Schools were struggling. Families worked twice as hard for half as much. And in the shadows of these challenges, the early whispers of a new economy and illicit one drifted through neighborhoods like rumors carried on wind. It was not loud yet, not destructive yet, but it was there, quietly rearranging the choices young men believed they had. On cracked basketball courts, games stretched long into the fading evening. You could hear the rhythm of bouncing balls echo between brick buildings, but even there, conversations about money, survival, and street codes occasionally slipped into the mix. Boys who once dreamed of small futures mechanics, postal workers, electricians were starting to look toward the men who drove new cars without having traditional jobs. It was subtle, barely noticeable to outsiders. But inside the community, the shift was unmistakable. Rayful felt the pull of these worlds before he fully understood them. His intelligence sharpened not through textbooks, but through observation. He noticed who earned respect, who avoided trouble, and who commanded fear without raising their voice. In every neighborhood, these figures existed, men who navigated the city with confidence and charisma, shaping its unofficial economy while remaining ghosts to those who lived outside its borders. The city itself seemed to nurture this duality. Mornings brought the smell of fresh bread from corner bakeries and the chatter of children walking to school. Afternoons carried heat waves rising off pavement, the laughter of teenagers gathered on steps, and the clatter of metro buses pulling to stops. But at night, the atmosphere shifted. The same streets that were harmless in daylight became corridors of risk. Music floated from open windows. Street corners evolved into informal meeting points. And the glow of neon signs from late-night takeout spots illuminated faces carrying stories far older than their years. Rayful learned early that opportunity was not evenly distributed. Some doors opened easily for certain people. Others required force or cleverness to unlock. His family worked hard, honest, long hours, but the reality around him was louder than any lecture about patience or discipline. He could see that intelligence alone did not guarantee stability. It was the environment that shaped ambition. And this environment rewarded those who maneuvered inside its unspoken systems. Older men noticed Rayful's quiet attentiveness. They saw a boy who didn't waste words, who analyzed before acting, who understood the value of information long before he understood the value of money. These men weren't mentors in the traditional sense. They didn't teach in classrooms or wear ties. But they taught lessons nonetheless, lessons about loyalty, caution, and the cost of missteps in streets where mistakes were rarely forgiven. Still, this chapter of his life wasn't defined by criminality. It was defined by formation, how a city's pressure shapes the steel inside a young person, how scarcity becomes a sculptor, how a place with such historical grandeur could still leave its own children navigating invisible storms. Poverty was not just an economic condition. It was a psychological climate. It shaped decisions before they were even consciously made. It guided dreams, limited options, and taught that survival sometimes meant bending rules that felt designed to break you. There were moments of beauty, two quiet corners of humanity that refused to erode. Block parties that brought neighbors together. Church choirs that filled sanctuaries with warmth. Small acts of kindness exchanged between strangers. The city was wounded, yes, but it was resilient. It lifted and failed in the same breath. It broke people and inspired them. And for someone like Rayful, growing up inside this duality meant learning early how to read the city's moods like a weather report. By the early 1980s, the wind had shifted. The storm that had been whispering at the edges of the city's consciousness was gathering strength. The drug epidemic that had quietly existed in corners was starting to move into the open. New substances, faster profits, higher risks. The city felt it before it understood it. Conversations at barbershops changed. Police presence increased. Fear and opportunity rose together like twin forces. Rayful, now older, sensed the change. Not with dread, but with caution. He was still a teenager, but the city's lessons had matured him faster than his years. He was sharp, composed, and already marked by the environment that shaped him. He watched the storm gather with the calm of someone who had been preparing for something without knowing what it was. Washington, D.C. was no longer just the backdrop of his life. It was a character, a teacher, a force, a city of storms that would soon transform him from observer to participant, from student to architect of an empire that would leave a permanent mark on its streets. And as the chapter closes, the storm hangs above the horizon, dark, inevitable, waiting to break. The first step is never loud. It doesn't announce itself or send warning bells through the air. It arrives quietly, carried by circumstance, wrapped in opportunity so subtle it barely feels like a choice at all. For Rayful Edmond, his entry into the world that would later define him began not with a gunshot or a chase, but with a whisper and invitation into a room where decisions were made in low voices and the future shifted its weight in the dark. He was still a teenager, balancing curiosity with a sense of invincibility that only youth can provide. The neighborhoods he walked were familiar, yet the paths that branched off them were beginning to look different. More intricate, more tempting. Late at night, when most of the city settled into uneasy sleep, Rayful found himself awake, drawn to the rhythm of streets that seemed to breathe differently after sundown. He remembered the first night clearly, the muffled sound of laughter behind a cracked apartment door, the thin line of light sliding beneath it, and the smell of cigarette smoke seeping into the hallway. Inside, a small group of older men lounged on mismatched chairs, their voices drifting like fog. A refrigerator hummed in the corner, its steady vibration the only constant in a room full of shifting intentions. Every surface seemed to hold a layer of history. Scratched tables, faded curtains, walls carrying the scent of years spent in conversation and negotiation. Rayful didn't enter with purpose. He entered because someone he respected nodded toward the door and said, "Come through for a minute." That was all. No explanation, no pressure, just a simple invitation. But the moment he stepped inside, something in him shifted. Not dramatically, not even visibly, but internally, quietly, the way soil shifts before a seed begins to sprout. The men didn't treat him like a child. They didn't coddle him or dismiss him. They observed him with interest, recognizing his intelligence long before he understood how valuable it was. They handed him no weapons, no stacks of money, just small tasks that tested responsibility and discretion. Simple errands. Messages to deliver, numbers to remember. These were gestures that showed trust without announcing it, and Rayful excelled at them effortlessly. His mind worked quickly, assembling patterns from fragments of information. He noticed how people reacted to certain names, how the flow of conversation changed when risk entered the room, how the men monitored each other without looking like they were paying attention. While others saw chaos, Rayful saw structure. While others acted impulsively, he calculated quietly, studying the efficiency of every movement, every exchange. This ability, this quiet analytical power, became his first currency. Outside, the city murmured in the night. Rain tapped gently against car roofs, soft enough to sound like someone breathing. Streetlights cast yellow halos onto wet pavement, turning each puddle into a shimmering window. Rayful walked between these reflections, replaying the conversations. He had heard the coded language, the subtle tension beneath casual jokes. There was something magnetic about it all, not the danger, but the intelligence required to navigate it. He felt himself leaning toward that world, not out of desperation, but out of fascination. His early tasks grew slightly more involved, accompanying someone to a late-night meeting, carrying a sealed envelope without asking questions, counting small stacks of money with focus and precision. Each step was modest, but each took him deeper into routines that shaped his sense of identity. He was still innocent enough to feel nervous, still grounded enough to hear the echo of his childhood behind him, but he was walking forward all the same. He learned to read the unspoken rules. He learned when to stay silent. He learned that the street economy was less about violence and more about information, who had it, who needed it, and who controlled its flow. The older men began to rely on him, not because of muscle or intimidation, but because he could anticipate needs before they were spoken. He remembered small details. He tracked people's tendencies. He predicted outcomes with startling accuracy. For someone his age, it was during one of these nights sitting in a dim living room lit only by the glow of a muted television that Rayful realized he was no longer standing at the edge of the shadows. He was already inside, further than he expected, drawn in not by force, but by logic, curiosity, and the quiet affirmation that he was needed, that he was effective. The men didn't praise him. They simply continued to hand him tasks. And in their trust, he felt the early beats of responsibility turning into influence. Even then, he was not reckless. He didn't rush toward opportunity. He measured each step with careful attention, watching how every choice connected to the next. But the line between observation and participation blurred quickly. The environment did not offer neutral zones. To be present was to be involved, even if the involvement was small. Some nights, he returned home with the smell of smoke still clinging to his clothes, his mind buzzing with the residue of conversations he wasn't sure he should have heard. He lay awake listening to the soft rumble of passing cars and the distant echo of sirens, wondering how decisions so small could feel so significant. There was no turning point, no dramatic shift, just a gradual acceptance that he was moving along a path shaped by environment, opportunity, and his own emerging sense of capability. Rayful didn't romanticize the streets. He understood their risks, but he also understood something deeper. The people who thrived were not the loudest, but the smartest. The ones who watched, the ones who adapted, the ones who could stand in a room full of tension and read it like a map. And in that understanding, he found his footing. As weeks passed, the men began to ask for his insights rather than simply his obedience. They noticed his calculations, his quick assessments, the way he could break down potential problems before they surfaced. Trust grew slowly but steadily. And with it came access to networks, to whispered plans, to the quiet machinery of a world that operated in the shadows long before he arrived. By the end of that season, Rayful was no longer just a young observer. He was a participant, subtly woven into the fabric of something larger than himself. He didn't feel powerful yet, just capable, just ready. And though he didn't know it, the steps he took in those dimly lit rooms were the first movements toward a rise that would soon surge beyond anything the men in that apartment, or even Rayful himself, could imagine. The shadows had accepted him, and he, perhaps without meaning to, had accepted them back. During the quiet hours of evening, when the campus softened into a hush and warm fluorescent lights glowed through thin dormitory curtains, Rayful Edmond sat among other students who had no idea who he really was. Outside, a breeze drifted through the nearly empty courtyard, rustling the leaves in a gentle rhythm. Inside, pages turned softly, highlighters streaked across textbooks, and the low hum of vending machines filled the hallways. College life carried a sense of innocence, a predictable rhythm anchored by classes, deadlines, and the steady hope of futures still unformed. And yet, within that calm setting, Rayful lived a second life, one that did not belong in lecture halls or on tidy campus lawns. He attended class like anyone else. He took notes with neat handwriting, responded to questions with measured intelligence, and sat quietly in the back row as professors spoke about economics, sociology, or political landscapes. He blended in seamlessly, his demeanor unassuming, his presence almost invisible in the swirl of academic life. But beneath the surface, the machinery of an entirely different world was turning. Each cod placed by Rayful himself, each motion, guided by decisions he made long after the study rooms emptied. There was something almost surreal about this duality. By day, he walked across campus with the same calm stride as his classmates, listening to laughter spill from dorm rooms, watching students toss frisbees across open lawns, breathing in the scent of freshly cut grass mingled with the aroma of coffee drifting from the student center. By night, he stepped into darker spaces where the air smelled of exhaust, cigarette smoke, and ambition, where conversations were clipped and cautious, where decisions carried weight, risk, and consequence. He did not glamorize it. He understood the split life he was living. But he also understood the efficiency of compartmentalization. In the light of day, he was a student. In the shadow of night, he was something else entirely, a rising architect of distribution, coordinating routes and relationships with the precision of a strategist twice his age. The first time he sat in a college library after conducting a late-night meeting, he felt the strange pull of contrast tightening around him. The silence of the reading room, filled with the soft tapping of keyboards and the faint shifting of bodies in chairs, felt worlds away from the tension that had filled the backseat of a car only hours earlier. He remembered the metallic clink of a door closing, the quiet confirmation exchanged between two men, the way streetlights illuminated their faces in fragmented gold. Then he remembered returning to campus, walking across the cool pavement, passing students whose biggest worries were upcoming exams or weekend plans. That contrast taught him something important, not about crime, but about adaptability. He learned how to change his expression, his posture, even his breathing, depending on which world he was standing in. He learned how to carry secrets without revealing their weight. And he learned that intelligence, when sharpened under pressure, could accelerate a rise far faster than force ever could. His network grew quietly, almost invisibly, like roots spreading beneath soil. There were no loud declarations, no dramatic moves. Just steady expansion, conversations behind partially closed doors, quick exchanges in shadowed parking lots, phone calls made with deliberate brevity. Rayful approached each decision like a student analyzing a complex problem, mapping supply lines, identifying inefficiencies, predicting outcomes before anyone else saw them coming. His academic discipline mirrored his street discipline, each informing the other in unexpected ways. Sometimes late at night, he returned to campus just as the sprinklers turned on across the athletic fields, casting fine mists into the air. Streetlights reflected off the droplets, creating a shimmering haze that made the world look strangely dreamlike. In those moments, Rayful felt suspended between two lives, one grounded in books and lectures, the other rising rapidly into a sphere of influence he could feel expanding around him like an invisible aura. And yet, beneath the efficiency and the rapid growth, something else began to stir, a quiet edge of superstition, a subtle whisper of paranoia. Nothing dramatic, just the faint awareness that secrecy has a weight, and that weight presses harder the more one carries. He noticed himself scanning rooms more often, registering exits without consciously thinking about it, listening for shifts in tone during conversations. These were not fears, exactly. More like instincts forming before he had the chance to question them. Still, he managed his dual life with remarkable calm. He woke early, completed assignments, attended every class. His professors saw him as composed and attentive. His classmates knew him as reserved but sharp. And no one, not one person on campus, suspected that the young man reviewing notes at a cafeteria table was quietly orchestrating a network that would soon reshape Washington, D.C.'s criminal landscape. At times, the emotional weight of secrecy felt almost meditative. He walked across campus at night, hearing the distant hum of traffic, the faint laughter from dorm windows, the rustling of trees swaying gently in the wind. He felt both part of the world and outside of it, moving through spaces coated in innocence, while carrying the momentum of decisions that no longer belong to innocence at all. On certain evenings, when the classroom lights dimmed and students filtered out in tired waves, Rayful remained behind for a moment, sitting in the quiet. He traced the grain of the desk beneath his fingers and listened to the metallic click of the door closing behind the last person. In that solitude, he could feel the line between his two identities tightening. It was not yet breaking, but it was stretching thin, fragile, and destined to snap eventually. He understood he was approaching a threshold. The more he built, the more the shadows demanded of him. The more he succeeded, the more attention and responsibility followed. And once movement accelerated in that world, it rarely slowed. He could sense the current pulling him forward, pushing him toward a pivotal transformation that would change not just his life, but the city that had raised him. Yet for now, he continued walking both paths, a student by day, a strategist by night, a young man balancing intellect and ambition with the quiet precision of someone who knew that mastery often begins long before anyone notices it. But soon, the worlds he kept separate would collide. And when they did, the rise would no longer be quiet, that it would be unmistakable. There's a certain kind of morning light that falls over Washington, Kia pale gold that softens the edges of row houses, glints against windshields, and makes the city appear gentler than it truly is. In those early years of Rayful Edmond's ascension, that light became the quiet backdrop of a transformation. It washed over streets that seemed unchanged on the surface, even as invisible currents shifted beneath them. And somewhere within that soft radiance, Rayful moved like a man walking between two worlds, one bright and bustling, the other shadowed by decisions that had begun to bend the rhythm of entire neighborhoods, that by the time his name carried weight. Whispered across blocks, Rayful's operations had expanded into something that resembled a quiet empire. It was not built through spectacle, nor through reckless force, but through structure, through the meticulous mind of a young man who understood patterns the way others understood music or mathematics. He saw cities as moving systems, networks of influence and opportunity, and with an almost uncanny precision, he shaped those systems to his will. Daylight made these changes easier to observe. You could see it in the steady flow of cars sliding through intersections with tinted windows and out-of-state plates. You could feel it in the subtle shifts of posture among men posted on corners, alert but collected, following routines that had become second nature. In the hum of busy streets, Rayful's presence lingered like an unseen conductor guiding a silent orchestra. The movements were coordinated, efficient, almost elegant in their execution, but Rayful himself rarely appeared in these scenes. He preferred distance, understanding that leadership was not about standing in the open, but about seeing the whole board from above. When he did venture out during the day, he blended seamlessly into the environment, quiet, composed, observing more than he spoke. His charisma worked in silence. People listened because there was something about his confidence that felt steady, unshakable. It was the kind of presence that made rooms still themselves for a moment, even if only subconsciously. His intelligence had become legend long before he reached his peak. Those who worked close to him often described him as a young man who absorbed information with remarkable ease. He understood inventory, logistics, and supply lines with the clarity of someone who had studied global trade rather than street economics. Delegation came naturally to him. He placed people where they were most effective, offered guidance when needed, and monitored operations with the quiet vigilance of someone who knew the cost of a single misstep. The empire functioned not through chaos, but through discipline. Yet for all his confidence, something inside him had begun to shift. Success, especially at a young age, has a way of sharpening the edges of solitude. There were moments rare, but unmistakable, when Rayful would sit alone in the stillness of an expensive townhouse, the afternoon sun streaking across polished surfaces. In those quiet intervals, he would lean back in a chair, eyes distant, as if contemplating the weight descending slowly upon his shoulders. The city outside buzzed with energy, but inside those walls, the silence spoke in ways he could not yet fully express. Leadership had changed him. It brought admiration, yes, and respect from people who saw in him a figure capable of reshaping their circumstances. But it also brought a growing detachment, a gradual disconnect between the ordinary world and the one he now inhabited. Conversations became shorter, trust became thinner. The air around him seemed to gather more scrutiny, not only from those who followed him, but from the community watching his rise with a mixture of fascination and fear. For some residents, Rayful represented opportunity. They saw him as a symbol of empowerment in neighborhoods where economic possibility had been scarce for decades. They spoke of his generosity, paid rents, unexpected help, a willingness to support those who felt invisible to the city's institutions. There were stories whispered on porches about young men he had steered away from trouble, about families he had quietly assisted during hard winters. To them, he was a figure who brought stability in a world that often felt unstable, but for others, the growing influence brought unease. They saw the increasing presence of out-of-town cars, the subtle shift in behavior among young men, the heaviness settling over certain blocks. Some sensed the fragility of it all, the way success built in shadows can ripple through a community in ways that are neither predictable nor kind. They noticed small changes, late-night sounds, worried glances, tension rising like heat from the pavement. They wondered how long the balance could hold before the consequences began to reveal themselves. The truth, as always, existed somewhere in the quiet space between these perspectives. Rayful's rise was both remarkable and unsettling, a paradox. Woven through the streets of Washington, he had created something that felt powerful, almost unstoppable, yet beneath that strength lay threads that could unravel with the slightest pull. Daylight illuminated everything, even the shadows he worked so hard to contain. Still, Rayful continued forward, guided by instinct and ambition. He walked through the city with the composure of someone who believed deeply in his own vision. He analyzed new opportunities, strengthened alliances, and adjusted to the shifting tides of a landscape that was beginning to take notice of him. The empire expanded not through noise, but through precision. Every decision he made created ripples, and each ripple carried echoes of future consequences. There were evenings when he would stand near a window, the sun settling low behind the city skyline. The golden light stretched across the streets, catching the edges of rooftops and casting long shadows against the buildings. In that fading glow, Rayful often appeared thoughtful, studying the world with eyes that saw both its beauty and its vulnerabilities. He understood that success had brought him to a place few could imagine, but he also sensed the fragile balance beneath his feet. The city, always full of stories, began to tell one about him, a story of rise, influence, and the quiet magnetism of a young man who seemed destined to shape the environment around him. But no story rises forever. And even in the warmth of daylight, even in the height of his empire, a subtle tension lingered like the first tremor before a storm. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably there. Rayful felt it in brief pauses, in the silence after a phone call, in the distant stare reflected in a window pane. The empire he had built was strong, almost immaculate in its structure. Yet somewhere deep within him, he knew that daylight exposes as much as it illuminates. And in that illumination, shadows are not erased, they are simply easier to see. And so, at the height of his power, surrounded by success that shimmered beneath the sun, Rayful Edmond III stood, unknowingly on the threshold of a shift that would change his life forever. There are moments in a man's life when the world around him begins to dim. Not suddenly, not violently, but slowly, like a room where someone keeps lowering the light, one notch at a time. For Rayful Edmond, that dimming began quietly. There was no single event, no dramatic shot across the bow. Instead, it came as a soft whisper, a shifting of air, a faint vibration beneath the surface of his empire. A feeling that something, somewhere had changed. And at first he didn't know whether the change was coming from outside or from within. The days were still bright on the streets of Washington, but Rayful's nights grew longer. He noticed it in the silence between conversations, in the way his phone rang at odd hours, then stopped before he could answer, in the way a familiar voice on the other end of the line suddenly spoke with caution, as if measuring each syllable, trimming every sentence to the bare minimum. Paranoia, real paranoia, never arrives with trumpets. It slips in through cracks through the thin spaces between certainty and fear. And Rayful, for the first time in years, began to feel those cracks widening. He started spending more time alone. Not because he wanted to, but because something inside him urged caution. Meetings that once happened in lively rooms now migrated to dim corners of quiet restaurants, where the only sounds were clinking glasses and the soft murmur of strangers. He kept conversations short, never raising his voice, never revealing more than necessary. Even laughter, once easy and abundant among his inner circle, became rare. Smiles grew thin. Eyes looked away too quickly. In his car, he began watching the rearview mirror more than the road ahead. Some nights he saw headlights that stayed a little too long behind him. Other nights he took unnecessary turns, testing the shadows. And more than once, he circled an entire block only to find the same dark-colored sedan drifting near the curb, engine humming softly like a patient predator. He didn't have proof, but he had instinct. And instinct, sharpened by years of navigating danger, told him something was shifting. He noticed a new rhythm in the city, an added presence, subtle but unmistakable. Men he didn't recognize standing too still on corners where people normally moved. Cars parked for hours with no one getting in or out. And the faint glimmer of reflections in windows where reflections shouldn't be. Surveillance has a texture, a temperature, a frequency. And Rayful could feel it all around him. Inside his home, the anxiety was quieter, but heavier. He began checking the door twice before locking it. He closed curtains he once left open. At night he would sit on the edge of his bed, elbows on knees, staring at the dim glow of the city outside, as if the skyline itself was watching him. Sleep, once effortless, became fractured. He woke from shallow dreams with the sensation that someone was standing outside his door. Some mornings he rose before dawn, pacing from room to room, trying to escape the tension that had taken root in his chest. Even familiar spaces felt foreign now. Rooms he once found comforting now felt too open, too exposed. His associates felt the shift as well. Conversations became more stilted. People spoke in half-thoughts, letting sentences trail off. They exchanged looks they never would have exchanged before, quick glances filled with uncertainty, worry, or the suspicion that someone else was listening. In parking lots, Rayful began speaking with his back to the wind, his voice low. He noted who arrived early, who arrived late, who avoided eye contact, and who seemed suddenly eager to please. Leadership, he realized, came with a new burden, not just managing people, but wondering which of them might fracture under pressure. And pressure was coming. Rumors drifted to him like smoke. Federal eyes on the streets, quiet investigations, sealed warrants, surveillance teams operating from rented rooms just a few blocks away. He heard whispers about microphones hidden in apartments, about cameras disguised as ventilation grates, about informants unnamed, unseen, moving like ghosts among familiar faces. Nothing was confirmed, but nothing needed to be. Rayful knew the feel of law enforcement interest, and this was something deeper, more patient. The kind of interest that didn't circle the perimeter, it seeped in. Inch by inch. His world began to contract. He trusted fewer people. He shared less. He spent more time thinking, analyzing, replaying conversations in his mind. He could sense his own caution turning into suspicion, his suspicion turning into isolation. And in isolation, a different kind of fear grows, not the fear of what might happen, but the fear of not knowing when it will. Even the community around him, a community he had once woven himself into so seamlessly, began shifting its gaze. Some people pulled back, creating distance as if protecting themselves from an unseen storm. Others whispered when he walked by, their voices soft, their expressions unreadable. There was no hostility, only the fragile unease that accompanies uncertainty. He noticed it in the way neighbors greeted him with shorter nods, the way familiar shopkeepers suddenly avoided long conversations, the way parents kept their children closer when he passed. The warmth that once surrounded him had begun to cool. And in that cooling, Rayful felt something he had never allowed himself to feel before: loneliness. There were nights he sat alone in dimly lit rooms, staring at the patterns of shadow on the walls. Nights when he wondered how it had all shifted so quickly, how the empire he built with such precision could feel so fragile beneath the surface. He thought about the decisions he had made, the choices that had shaped his life, the weight of responsibility he carried. And for the first time, he sensed the invisible threads pulling at him from all directions. Power isolates, influence isolates. But paranoia isolates most of all. He thought about the people he trusted, wondering if trust itself was becoming a liability. He thought about the structures he built, wondering which cracks were the first to appear. And he thought about the federal agents he could not see, wondering how close they were, how long they had been watching, how much they already knew. In the quiet, he could almost hear them. Not their voices, but their presence. The soft click of a recording device somewhere in the dark. The distant idle of an unmarked car. The faint echo of footsteps on pavement long after the street had emptied. Whispers in the dark. That was what his world had become. A place where silence was no longer peaceful, and shadows no longer offered safety. A place where every sound felt like a warning, every movement like a message. And deep down, Rayful knew the truth. The darkness was only beginning to speak. The quiet rhythm of Washington, D.C., that had once carried Rayful Edmond III's careful orchestration of power now began to shift imperceptibly, almost like the subtle tremor before a storm. There were no sirens wailing in the night, no dramatic raids that shattered windows. Instead, the pressure came in whispers and delays, in subtle changes that only someone attuned to the flow of influence could perceive. It began with absences. Associates who once walked with certainty now hesitated, their glances darting toward unfamiliar faces, the weight of caution pressing down on them. Some offered excuses for missed meetings, others spoke in clipped tones on the phone, always careful, always measured. Rayful, ever observant, noticed the pauses in conversations, the hesitation in handshakes, the micro-adjustments of loyalty that betrayed the invisible hand now pressing closer. Inside dimly lit apartments and narrow corridors, he sifted through messages and reports with meticulous care. The once predictable routines of his network now seemed fractured, every delivery, every transaction requiring additional scrutiny. The air carried a new tension, one that was heavy but unseen, the kind that settled into the bones and made sleep a fleeting commodity. Nights became longer, the silence broken only by the occasional murmur of a car idling long outside, or the soft click of a door left ajar by someone who did not entirely trust themselves. Each sound, each moment, carried significance, and Rayful's mind cataloged them all, analyzing for threat, for loyalty, for patterns that might reveal what lay ahead. Federal scrutiny, once a distant shadow, now loomed closer. Agents moved like ghosts through offices filled with dim light and the muted shuffle of paper. Their presence was never announced with dramatic flair. Instead, it was methodical, deliberate, and relentless. Surveillance tapes, coded communications, and confidential informants built a mosaic that inched forward day by day, quietly eroding. the margins of control Rayful had once commanded. He understood the calculus of consequence. Each decision carried ripples, and each ripple had the potential to collide with forces beyond his influence. Emotionally, the strain began to etch lines of fatigue onto a face that had rarely betrayed vulnerability. The solitude of his private spaces, once a refuge, became arenas of quiet tension. Trust fractured slowly, imperceptibly at first, then unmistakably. Friends who had shared laughter and loyalty now spoke in measured tones, as though weighing every syllable against an unseen ledger of risk. Conversations carried weight. Even a pause, a shrug, or a faint smile became freighted with potential meaning. Rayful felt the increasing isolation, the subtle contraction of his empire as fear and caution began to govern behavior more than ambition or camaraderie. Outside, the city itself seemed to reflect the shifting tides. Neighborhood corners that had once been animated with energy now bore an air of muted vigilance. Street chatter carried undertones of speculation and concern, the hum of activity tinged with an awareness of observation. Communities that had once tolerated the quiet authority of the young kingpin now murmured in cautious tones, unsure where allegiance should lie. The streets, always a mirror of power and consequence, whispered that the equilibrium was tipping, that the balance between influence and exposure had begun to falter. Amid this slow contraction, internal fractures became more pronounced. The structure Rayful had so meticulously built an intricate web of distribution, protection, and hierarchy showed signs of stress. Minor errors magnified under scrutiny. Miscommunications became indicators of vulnerability. He watched as individuals, even those previously considered uncheckable, exhibited caution that bordered on hesitation, a subtle but profound shift that signaled the beginning of cracks in the foundation. Rayful's psychological awareness deepened with each passing day. He felt the narrowing of choices, the compression of possibilities, the quiet certainty that one misstep could cascade into irreversible consequence. Paranoia was no longer a symptom, but a companion, a lens through which every interaction, every note, every handshake was interpreted. Sleep was measured in stolen fragments, nights spent pacing through rooms illuminated by the faint glow of streetlights, mind racing through contingency plans, through the human calculus of loyalty and betrayal. Each sound, each shadow carried meaning. Each misstep in judgment had the potential to unravel months of careful control. The federal net tightened incrementally. Associates were discreetly approached, their testimonies slowly stitched together into a portrait of a structure that, from the outside, appeared monolithic but was vulnerable at critical junctures. Rayful observed the subtle withdrawals, familiar faces absent from meetings. Calls returned with unnatural hesitation, rumors circulating in whispers that only heightened his vigilance. He understood that these were not isolated incidents, but patterns, early signs of a system beginning to collapse under scrutiny and internal strain. Emotionally, he wrestled with the duality of his existence. The pride of empire, the thrill of intellectual and organizational mastery, contended with the dread of exposure. His analytical mind cataloged every detail, every nuance, yet even precision could not halt the erosion of certainty. Loneliness grew as his understanding of the fragility of trust deepened. Power, once a protective canopy, now felt like a weight pressing inward, compressing the margins of freedom he had once taken for granted. By the chapter's end, the slow unraveling became inevitable. Rayful, seated in a quiet room with a view of the city he had shaped in both overt and subtle ways, sensed the narrowing of paths before him. The empire, once expansive and unchallenged, had begun to contract under invisible pressure. Decisions once fluid now felt bound by circumstance and observation. The external calm belied an internal storm, a crescendo not of explosions but of quiet, relentless, unavoidable consequence. He understood with a somber clarity that the world had shifted. The fall had begun, not with fanfare, but with the subtle, unyielding mechanics of observation, loyalty, and time. In that stillness, Rayful's gaze drifted toward the street below, illuminated by a soft, amber glow from the lamplights that cast long, hesitant shadows. He could feel the pulse of the city, its rhythm now altered by forces beyond any single mind or strategy. The walls, both literal and metaphorical, had begun their silent encroachment. Each step forward was now measured, each interaction carefully weighted. The whispers in the dark carried not only information but inevitability. And in that suspended moment, the listener senses the first tremors of an empire that, however brilliant and formidable, could not endure untouched by scrutiny, pressure, and the unrelenting tide of consequence. The courthouse loomed in muted authority, its stone facade reflecting the pale light of a winter morning. Rain-slicked streets led toward polished doors, carrying a scent of wet concrete and asphalt that clung to the soles of shoes and the edges of coats. Inside, the atmosphere shifted, thick with formality and expectation, each footstep echoing against marble floors as if the building itself held its breath. In this quiet, methodical environment, the ordinary rhythms of life were replaced by ritual and structure. Every shuffle of papers, every scratch of a pen, every soft murmur amplified by the polished solemnity of the space. Here, Rayful Edmond III moved like a solitary figure in a vast measured universe, his presence both central and oddly diminished against the backdrop of law. He sat at the defendant's table, a figure still and composed, yet acutely aware of the layers of observation surrounding him. Lawyers adjusted jackets, whispered under breaths, and consulted notes with careful precision. Each juror, each clerk, each official bore witness not only to the proceedings, but to the gravity of a life meticulously chronicled. The testimony, delivered in quiet, measured tones, painted scenes that Rayful had already lived: dealings, decisions, strategies, and failures. The echoes of his youth and rise, once carried on city streets and whispered among associates, were now catalogued in transcripts and affidavits, stripped of color but heavy with consequence. Time in the courtroom stretched with deliberate slowness. Long pauses followed each question, breaths hung in the air, and the soft creak of chairs punctuated the stillness. Rayful observed the proceedings with the patience of someone who understood the weight of narrative, how stories are built and interpreted by those who wield the tools of observation. The subtle facial expressions of witnesses, the shifting posture of jurors, the faint tapping of a gavel, all became elements in a landscape that demanded calm, attention, and strategic restraint. Every word mattered, every pause significant, emotionally. He felt the accumulation of years press inward. Reflections on power, choices, and consequences surfaced not as sudden realizations, but as quiet acknowledgments. The paths he had carved through Washington streets, the lives he had touched or disrupted, the ambitions that had driven him forward, all converged in these measured hours. There was no theatricality in the loss of freedom, only a creeping awareness that decisions, once distant and abstract, had returned with inevitability. The law, in its structured silence, revealed the culmination of a life shaped by intellect, strategy, and human complexity. Outside, the city continued its rhythm, oblivious yet resonant with echoes of Rayful's past. Street corners, once vibrant with controlled chaos, now seemed muted, almost contemplative under the gray sky. Rain fell intermittently, carrying the scent of wet asphalt, of aged brick, and of neighborhoods that had both nurtured and challenged him. Within the courtroom, those same streets were distilled into evidence, testimony, and careful argumentation. The spaces of his empire had been measured, mapped, and recorded, transforming lived experience into documentation. The pacing of the day mirrored the internal tempo of reflection. Hours moved in gentle increments, each moment an invitation to observe, to process, to internalize. Rayful felt the unusual weight of being at the center of narrative, yet removed from its energy. He was both subject and spectator, the consequences tangible yet abstract, the presence in the room heavy with expectation yet enveloped in quiet. The trial was not a spectacle of sound or chaos. It was a patient, relentless accounting of cause and effect, measured and unyielding. Witnesses spoke in muted tones, recalling events with clinical precision. Rayful's associates were described not as mythic figures, but as elements of an intricate system, each role defined, each movement accounted for. The structure he had built, once expansive and adaptive, now lay exposed, dissected through the lens of legality and testimony. There was a strange poetry to the process, the rhythm of speech, the cadence of questioning, the subtle interplay of attention and interpretation. Every observer, every participant, became part of a choreography that neither praised nor condemned, but simply revealed. Emotionally, Rayful oscillated between calm observation and the quiet ache of inevitability. There was pride in understanding the mechanisms at work, the strategies that had once made him formidable, yet a steady sorrow in recognizing the cost. The faces of those he had guided, those who had followed, now appeared in reports, affidavits, and the testimonies of witnesses who carried the weight of memory. He noted them with a precision born of years spent analyzing people, influence, and human behavior. Nothing was ignored, yet every moment underscored the narrowing of opportunity, the gradual closure of doors that had once opened with such certainty throughout the day. The courtroom itself seemed alive with a quiet gravity. Light from high. Windows cast muted patterns on polished floors, shadows moving subtly across faces and desks. The scent of paper, polished wood, and faint human perspiration filled the space, grounding the surreal experience in the tangible. Conversations outside his hearing were filtered through the haze of attention and observation, the city outside pressing in only through the occasional distant honk or the muted rush of rain against stone. By the time proceedings reached the final stages, a sense of inevitability had settled like a soft fog. The verdict, while yet to be delivered, was an almost tactile presence, hovering over the room, felt in the collective stillness of jurors, lawyers, and defendant alike. Rayful, ever perceptive, read the subtle shifts, the quiet exchange of glances, the careful alignment of documents, the faint tightening of expressions. Here, in the hushed cadence of law, he confronted the undeniable truth. A life meticulously built and observed by himself and others had reached a turning point. When the final moments arrived, they carried neither spectacle nor dramatics, only a quiet gravity. Words were pronounced, papers signed, and the judge's voice, steady and measured, framed the transition with calm authority. For Rayful, the sound was neither victory nor defeat, but acknowledgement. The journey of ambition, strategy, and influence now intersected with consequence, and the boundaries of freedom had shifted irrevocably. The chapter closes on a subtle, haunting image. Rayful rising from the bench, the polished floor reflecting the faint glow of overhead lights, the soft rain outside a mirror to the steady, unchanging rhythm of life beyond the courtroom walls. The city continued, indifferent yet resonant, carrying memories of power, ambition, and consequence. The courtroom, in its quiet and deliberate pace, had transformed past and present into reflection and reckoning. As Rayful moved forward into the unknown confines of the next chapter of life, the listener feels both the weight of history and the inevitability of change. A life, once expansive and audacious, now measured, contained, and quietly poised for reflection. The first light of morning seeped slowly through the narrow slats of the cell window, scattering pale stripes across the concrete floor. Each beam illuminated the small confined space with an almost cruel precision, highlighting the cold metal of the bed frame, the chipped paint of the walls, and the faint scuff marks left by years of footsteps that had passed through these corridors. Outside, the distant hum of the prison footsteps echoing down hallways, the occasional metallic clang, the soft murmur of voices created a rhythm that was steady yet oppressive. a pulse that marked time without mercy. For Rayful Edmond III, the world had contracted into this measured space, where every hour, every sound, every shadow became amplified and intimate. Days settled into quiet routines. He rose with the slow, deliberate cadence of habit, noting the soft scraping of chairs as others moved, the gentle hiss of running water in communal sinks, and the faint metallic tang of the air, heavy with the mixture of cleaning agents and human presence. Meals were served in quiet lines. Voices mingled in subdued conversation, careful and deliberate, with pauses that hinted at unspoken alliances and invisible hierarchies. Each interaction was observed with precision, a mind trained to read patterns and anticipate movements, even in confinement. In these moments of stillness, Rayful's thoughts turned inward. Memories of his childhood surfaced, tinted with the soft glow of nostalgia yet edged with understanding. He recalled the small houses, the bustling streets of Washington, D.C., the lessons learned in alleyways and classrooms alike. Each memory, vivid and detailed, carried with it the emotional weight of choices made, some guided by survival, others by ambition. He traced the steps of his rise, the careful calculations, the networks of trust, the early indicators of influence. That had seemed almost ordinary at the time, now magnified by hindsight. Evenings brought a deeper quiet. The cell dimmed to shadows, and the distant echo of life beyond his walls seemed both tantalizing and unreachable. Rayful moved slowly, taking note of the subtle sounds, the faint rustle of sheets, the rhythmic breathing of others in neighboring cells, the soft scratch of pen on paper as correspondence was written and read. Letters became lifelines, fragile threads connecting him to a world moving without pause. Through ink and paper, he traced connections, provided guidance, and quietly nurtured relationships with those still navigating streets he had once commanded. Time, once measured by opportunity and action, now flowed differently, elongated, reflective, and insistent. Moments stretched into hours, hours into days, and the mind, freed from the frenetic demands of empire, wandered deeply into the contours of past decisions. He examined not only the strategies that had elevated him, but also the subtleties of human nature that had allowed him to lead. Paradoxically, confinement offered clarity. Patterns previously obscured by noise and movement now emerged with striking definition. Every choice, every misstep, every triumph revealed its consequences in quiet, unrelenting detail. Rayful's reflection was not simple self-recrimination nor boastful recollection. It was a meditation on influence, ambition, and the fragility of control. He considered those who had followed him, the lives touched, disrupted, or reshaped by his decisions. Empathy surfaced alongside strategic assessment, creating a complex emotional landscape where pride and regret coexisted. He found himself tracing connections that had once seemed invisible, the invisible strings of loyalty, fear, and opportunity that had held his world together. In this stillness, insight emerged, tempered by the stark reality of current confinement. The prison itself became a character in his contemplations. The narrow corridors, the metallic clang of gates, the patterned repetition of doors, cells, and staircases all reflected a microcosm of order and control, yet with boundaries constantly enforced. He observed the interplay of personalities, the subtle tensions, and the small, almost imperceptible victories of those adapting to life within these walls. It was an environment demanding patience, observation, and quiet strategy, not unlike the streets he once commanded, but compressed, relentless, and unyielding. Despite confinement, moments of connection persisted. Through careful observation, measured words, and the occasional conversation across tables or through cell bars, Rayful maintained influence, subtle and understated. Advice was given, guidance offered, and a reputation built over years of meticulous action continued to ripple outward, even as physical presence was denied. Each interaction required attentiveness, patience, and understanding of human nature. skills honed through years on the streets now repurposed in silence. As days unfolded, the boundary between past and present blurred. The streets of Washington, D.C., with their cacophony of sound, their hum of commerce and survival, existed now in memory and in the occasional letter or whispered report from the outside. He traced the rise and fall of networks in thought, reflecting on strategy, missteps, and unforeseen consequences. The empire he had commanded no longer existed physically under his control, yet its echoes remained embedded in consciousness, in the city's memory, and in the lives of those who had moved within it. Evening walks in the yard became moments of quiet liberation. The wind, soft yet insistent, brushed against his face, carrying scents of wet grass, distant asphalt, and the faint city beyond the fences. He breathed in the subtle reminder that life persisted, that the world beyond the walls continued to turn, and that influence, though altered in form, remained part of the narrative he had shaped. In these moments, introspection deepened, blending memory, emotion, and observation into a quiet meditation on existence, consequence, and resilience. The chapter closes on this reflective note. Rayful, standing alone in the yard, eyes closed, to the dimming light, allows the wind to trace its way across his face. He feels the rhythm of a life once lived at full throttle, now slowed to deliberate pace. A world contracted yet endlessly observed. The stillness of incarceration becomes not only a limitation but a mirror, reflecting the complex interplay of ambition, consequence, and enduring human insight. Within these walls, Rayful finds both the weight of regret and the subtle strength of reflection, a quiet, contemplative chapter in a life marked by brilliance, audacity, and the inexorable passage of time. The rain fell quietly over Washington, D.C., each droplet pattering against asphalt, car roofs, and the faces of stoic street lamps. The city seemed smaller, more intimate in the soft wet light, as if the storm had condensed its edges and drawn attention to the spaces where memory lingered. Here, in alleys and on stoops, on cracked basketball courts, and beneath the muted glow of corner store signs, the echoes of Rayful Edmond III's life still whispered. His story had become a part of the city's rhythm, not in the way of fear or control, but as an indelible pattern of choices and consequences that shaped both streets and imagination. Older residents walked the neighborhoods with measured steps, their eyes carrying the weight of lived history. Some remembered Rayful with a quiet sorrow, recalling the young men who had once followed him, bright-eyed and ambitious, only to fall into the darker currents he had navigated. Others spoke with nostalgia, recalling the days when his presence commanded order, and even in chaos, there was an underlying structure. And still others remembered with hardened reflection, a recognition of how the pursuit of power, however brilliant, inevitably intersects with loss. Conversations were rarely loud. They drifted like echoes down hallways, over fences, and through the air, shaped by decades of reflection. Younger generations approached his story differently. They heard his name through music that celebrated or lamented, through documentaries that traced facts with careful narrative, through whispered folklore on playgrounds and in classrooms. To them, Rayful existed simultaneously as a myth, a cautionary tale, and a fragment of local legend, a symbol whose contours had softened over time. The narrative was fragmented, layered with imagination and interpretation, yet it retained its emotional weight, a testament to the enduring resonance of human ambition and fallibility. Walking through the rain-washed streets, the listener feels the textures of the city, the damp scent of brick and concrete, the metallic tang of wet asphalt, the faint smoke of food from nearby vendors, all blending into a sensory mosaic that mirrors the layered complexity of Rayful's influence. Empty lots that once teemed with the promise of power now lie silent, overgrown with weeds, but the stories they hold remain alive in memory. Faded photographs tucked in drawers, letters yellowed by time, and casual mentions in passing conversations. tie the past to the present, revealing how a single life can ripple outward in countless unseen ways. The cultural impact of Rayful's life extends quietly but pervasively. His story has become a point of reference in discussions of opportunity and inequity, illustrating how intelligence and ambition intersect with systemic neglect and social circumstance. Scholars, journalists, and community leaders reference him with care, understanding that the narrative is not only about crime, but also about the forces that shape human decision-making, survival, and ingenuity. Even artists find in his life a kind of poetic tension, the collision of brilliance and peril, aspiration and consequence, the fragile balance between vision and destruction. Listeners are drawn into the intimate details of these streets and homes. They hear the faint chatter of neighbors, the soft laughter of children in distant yards, the rustle of leaves and the whisper of rain across windows. Through these sensory observations, the city itself becomes a narrator, speaking through environment and memory, revealing the ways Rayful's presence continues to shape rhythm, perception, and story. The reflections are never sensationalized. The focus remains emotional, poetic, and meditative, drawing attention to subtle currents rather than overt spectacle. The narrative moves seamlessly between past and present, folding the rise and fall of Rayful into the living city around it. A retired store owner recalls the meticulousness of his operation, the strange duality of fear and respect it inspired, while a young musician hums lyrics that hint at tales half-remembered. In small apartments, letters from distant family members are read quietly, offering perspectives that blend affection, disappointment, and acknowledgement of enduring impact. Each anecdote, each memory, adds texture to a larger mosaic of legacy, allowing the listener to feel not just the facts of a life, but the emotional resonance that persists decades later. Pacing remains deliberate and reflective, allowing space for the weight of contemplation. Rain continues to fall, slow and insistent, drawing attention to detail, the shimmer of water on pavement, the distorted reflections of streetlights in puddles, the quiet breath of the city at night. The story emphasizes subtle lessons embedded in memory. Ambition can illuminate paths but also cast long shadows. Leadership can inspire and protect, yet exact emotional and ethical costs. Choices ripple beyond immediate perception, touching lives in ways both intended and unforeseen. The chapter gradually approaches its closing image. Rayful's name, once spoken in the breathless tones of fear or awe, now drifts gently in the air, softer but persistent. Across neighborhoods, his life is remembered in fragments through conversation, in song, in quiet introspection. The narrative pauses on these echoes, allowing listeners to absorb the complexity, to understand that legacy is rarely simple, rarely contained within singular definitions of good or evil. It is lived, remembered, interpreted, and refracted through the perceptions of many. In the final cinematic moment, the city and its story converge. A gentle Washington rain falls steadily, droplets catching the muted glow of streetlights, casting a silvery shimmer over brick facades and narrow alleys. The air is cool, fresh, and intimate. Somewhere, a child looks out a window, an older man nods in reflection, and a teenager murmurs a name they have heard, but do not fully understand. Rayful Edmond III exists in these spaces, not as a figure of dominance or fear, but as a narrative, a caution, and a testament to the enduring interplay between ambition, consequence, and memory. The echo of his name drifts across streets, alleys, and corners, soft as the rainfall, lingering in thought and conversation. It is not the sound of power reclaimed, but the resonance of history and human complexity. A life measured not only in deeds but in the perceptions, emotions, and reflections it leaves behind. The city breathes with these memories, allowing Rayful's story to persist, not as legend or myth, but as a living echo, a reminder of what was, what might have been, and the enduring imprint of a life that touched a city in profound, intricate ways.